He did the articleship under Sri P.V. Lakshmi Narayana, and he became an ACA in 1983, and he became an FCA in 19. Sorry, I'm getting disturbance. He became in 1988. He cleared his information system audit examination conducted by the ICAI in September 2002 by securing All India 10th rank. He is empaneled as peer review with peer reviewer board of ICAI. He presented papers on bank audit, accounting standards, auditing and assurance standards, and peer review at several CPE seminars organized by SIRC and benches. He has presented papers at seminar organized by the Chairman of Chamber of Commerce. Sorry. He has contributed articles in CA journals and SIRC newsletters. He has co-authored a book on bank audit. He is a faculty member of training programs organized by the CAG Office Chennai, NAS, IOB, Staff Training Colleges, and Tamil Nadu Commercial Taxes Department, etc. He is a voluntary blood donor and donated blood more than 40 times in the last 12 years. He is married to Mrs. Girija, an electronic engineer, and has a 20 years old daughter. With these few lines, I'm introducing our speaker, CAS Ramesh, to the August gathering. Thank you very much, sir. And I'm handovering the proceedings to the chairperson.
Sir, I request the speaker to take up. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Salutations to all my gurus, without whose help and guidance, I certainly wouldn't be what I am today or where I am today. Good evening. It is indeed my pleasure to be with all of you this evening to share my thoughts on tax audit documentation. I am not sure how many of you remember the 27th day of February this year. On that day, I enjoyed the hospitality of your branch when I was physically present in your lovely city to address my fellow professionals on bank audit. I can't seem to forget that day, as it was the penultimate seminar I attended. A few days after that, I addressed a seminar organized with the Kanjipuram branch. Incidentally, that branch is also headed by a woman. And I bow my head and take my hat off to woman power, the women's ICAI power. From the month of April, I have addressed several webinars and virtual classes, but I have not enjoyed it as much as I enjoy a seminar. How I wish the new normal goes away and we get back to holding live seminars, maybe in addition to webinars and virtual meetings. In a live seminar, I've always enjoyed the warmth and hospitality of the members and have gained immensely from my interactions with them. As I address the members or the students, I keep looking at the expression on their faces and know whether they've assimilated what I have stated and or whether they agree with me or not. Based on this non-verbal feedback, I tend to make mid-course corrections and try to put across my views as clearly as possible. I am unable to do any of this in a webinar where I am forced to look at a computer screen and talk. This is very difficult for a person like me who loves to hear even for a person like me who loves to hear his own voice. But then again, we are living in difficult times and have to get used to the new normal. I only wish the situation passes soon and we hold live seminars again. Let me come to the topic of this evening's webinar. Tax audit documentation, myth or mystique. When the chairman of the branch requested me to coin the topic of the seminar, I came up with this heading, and since that moment, I have regretted the same. With due respects to William Wordsworth, I gazed and gazed, but little thought what misery the topic had brought to me. I am still not able to understand why I chose myth or mystique. Maybe the only reason was to attract the members to log in. If we had just said tax audit documentation, most members would have felt that this is a topic that they have listened to several times and may not have logged in. The heading was perhaps to make the topic more attractive. Like, you know, the new improved surf, the product is the same, but the catchy slogan, is that what it was all about? Having said that in a lighter vein, let us look at why it is a myth. One of the dictionary meanings of myth is a widely held but false belief or idea. I have always believed that tax audit documentation is not practiced as much as it is spoken about, and hence I call it a myth. To be fair, I believe that most of the tax audit documentation would already have been covered during the audit of the financial statements, and all that is required is to cross-index them for the financial stat audit documentation and look at certain things which we don't look at a financial statement when we audit a financial statement, and see whether we have documentation for those questions also. Let us now move on to the topic, and at the end of the session, see why the tax audit documentation is a mystique. Before we look at the coverage of my sessions, a disclaimer I think would be in order. This is not a discourse on income tax, but a session where I'll be highlighting the need for documentation and how to go about it. I am not an expert on income tax, and my views are strictly personal in nature. During the course of the next 1.5 hours, we will look at tax audit introduction, something with which we are all familiar, but consequent to the amendments and the limits, I feel it warrants a fresh look. The scope of peer review. Peer review, as we all know, is all pervasive, and if we are unable to demonstrate to the peer reviewer that we have carried out our attest functions with the required due diligence and have complied with all the applicable standards, we are likely to be in a soup, and hence we will look at the scope of the peer review and how to pass the same. Today, most colleges, most universities of all state governments are giving all pass for students without taking an exam. I don't think that is going to happen in our institute. We still have to pass the peer review test, and for that we need to be prepared. While we know how to conduct an audit, what we lack is how to document our work. There are firms in the country which document their work, whether they do audit or not is immaterial. The documentation is a must. Whereas I sincerely believe that medium practitioners like me and small and medium practitioners like all of us gathered here generally do a very good quality audit, but what we don't do is documentation. In fact, by the time the assessees come to us, it is the last week of the month in which the tax audit report is to be submitted. And where is the time to do documentation? But let us remember that documentation is the only thing that will save our skin tomorrow with the tax authorities, with the disciplinary committee, the ICAI, and with anybody else who questions our work. We will then spend a little time looking at the relevant auditing standards. Why auditing standards? We all know accounting standards, but auditing standards are things which we don't normally read. In fact, I find auditing standards to be so dry that it is a very good recommendation for insomnia. If you are suffering from lack of sleep, you are not able to sleep, pick up a book on auditing standards, and I assure you in 3 minutes time you will go to sleep. It is about time that the branches across the country, or at least especially those in the southern region, hold a 6-hour workshop on auditing standards where we need to get speakers who will come and tell us not the theory in those standards, but what do we mean by documentation? What is evidence? For a particular line item in the P&L or the balance sheet, what are the kind of documentation that are required? Where do we look for those evidences? I have been in practice for almost 38 years now. And if I remember right, the tax audit came in the year 1985. So which means I have been practicing tax audit for the last 36 years or so. These accounting standards and auditing standards were not available then. Auditing standards came much later, maybe 8 or 10 years after I started practice, the auditing standards came, or even later. Accounting standards themselves came about 8 or 10 years later. So does it mean that I did not do any documentation in those days? Well, to be very honest and in a lighter vein, I probably don't do documentation even today. But in those days also I had documentation. If I could defend my work. What is documentation? Documentation is essentially the process that you evolved to come at the conclusion that you finally came to. That is documentation. And I think we all need to look at those auditing standards which are today mandatory for corporates. When we are doing the audit of non-corporate, maybe they might not be mandatory. But companies that have said auditing standards are mandatory. Therefore, we need to look at them. And then I always feel that one learns from the errors committed by others. And so it may be useful to look at the deficiencies pointed out by the peer reviewers. peer review board has pointed out several deficiencies that have been noticed by the peer reviewers. They've got a booklet on that, and I've taken a few of them for the sake of passing on to the members so that they understand what are the common errors in the peer review reports. And finally, we'll look at audit documentation and audit evidence. Let's look at applicability other than professional income. If the turnover is more than 5 crores, there is no issue. 44AB audit is applicable to every assessee who has a turnover of more than 5 crores. What happens if the turnover is between 2 crores to 5 crores? And then we look at what happens if the turnover is less than 2 crores. When the turnover is more than 2 crores to 5 crores, if the cash receipt and the cash payments are less than 5% of the total receipts and total payments, then there is no audit. Then there is no audit required. If the cash receipts and cash payments are more than 5% of the total receipts and payments, then 44AB audit will be applicable. Now, what do we understand by the term cash receipts and cash payments? Let us look at the Act. The Act says whose aggregate of all amounts received, including amount received for sales, turnover, or gross receipts during the previous year in cash does not exceed 5% of the said amount. Does it mean that all receipts are included in this? Then they go on to say in B, they say aggregate of all payments made, including amount incurred for expenditure in cash during the previous year of the said payment. This clause shall have effect as if for the words 1 crore, the words 5 crore has been substituted. In other words, they say, if it is more than 1 crore, you need to do a tax audit. But if the cash receipts and cash payments are less than 5% of the total receipts and total payments, up to 5 crores, a tax audit is not compulsory. What is this cash receipt and cash payment? Does it mean of my total sales, the collection from my total sales or my gross receipts, is that the only receipts that I take and I look at whether 95% or more of them is in form other than cash, or do I take all receipts, including loan receipts? For example, if I have borrowed something like 50 lakhs on 4 different times during the year and I paid them, then 2 crores receipts is there and 2 crores payment is there. Do I add them on to the receipts and the payments to compute this 5%? In my opinion, it is subject to debate. In my opinion, I don't think we should add anything other than income and expenditure receipt. Because the intention of the legislature is to curb cash business and take it forward to a digital economy. Moreover, there are specific sections to deal with loans. 269 SS is there. And hence, I am of the view that they should not be considered. Contra items, cash withdrawn from bank, is that there is a receipt, and when I deposit cash into the bank, there is a payment. But then there are contra items. I think those also should be eliminated. We should eliminate contra items. We should eliminate things that, which are in the nature of loans. We should eliminate drawings of the sole proprietor because again, one can't pay oneself, and therefore those are not payments and it should be eliminated. But after all this, let's look at compute the total receipt and total payments, and if the cash receipts and cash payments compared to the total receipt payment is not more than 5%, then even up to 5 crores, we do not have to do an audit. But if it is more than 5%, obviously we need to do an audit. What are the practical issues in some of these things? Before going there, let's also look at less than 2 crores. So between 2 crores and 5 crores, we know what it is. But less than 2 crores, if it is an individual HUO for a firm, if the net profit shown is less than 8% or 6% of the case may be, then audit is applicable. 8% for those gross receipts and sales which are in cash, and 6% for those gross receipts and payments which are in form other than cash. But if it is more than 8% or 6%, then no audit is required under 44AD. So even if the turnover is up to 2 crores, but you are showing a profit, you are showing a net profit of more than 8% or 6%, as the case may be, you don't have to do a tax audit. What about others? That is, other than individual, HUF and firm. In the case of LLP or companies or other associates, if the turnover is less than 1 crore, there is no audit. If the turnover is more than 1 crore, CR and CP is less than 5%, then again there's no audit. Otherwise, there will be an audit. This is what the crux of the whole thing is. Now let's look at some practical problems. I have a client who is in the business of acquiring patients. Please note, she acquires patients, both domestic and personal. Yes, Mr. Prashant. Mr. Prashant, you raised your hand. Do you have a question? Or is that by mistake? I'll do one thing, Chairman. I will go ahead. We will take the questions at the end. Okay?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Can you hear me now, sir?
Right. I have a client who's in the business of acquiring patients, both domestic patients and international patients for hospitals. The hospital compensate my client by a fee which is normally a percentage of the fee collected from the patient. The hospital pays my client after deducting tax at 10%. Her turnover is 70 lakhs. The question is she liable to tax audit? Prima facie, it looks as if she is liable to tax audit. But if you take a close and detailed look, it will be revealed that the assessee is not carrying on a profession, but is carrying on a business. She is not a professional. She is not carrying on the profession of medical services. She is an ordinary graduate with contacts to get clients from abroad to come and get themselves treated in Indian hospitals, for which she is paid a remuneration by the hospitals, which is a percentage of the fee that they collect from the patient. In other words, a commission. Therefore, the hospital should have actually deducted tax at source under 194H, which also says it is 10%, but they have done it under 194J. As far as the hospital is concerned, they have deducted the right rate, 10%. So they are not bothered whether they need to report it under 194J or 194H. Since they have been reporting all the payment made to doctors under 194J at 10%, they have reported this also under 194J instead of reporting under 194H. Just because the TDS was accounted by the deductor under a wrong head or a section, will it change the character of the income, which in this case is commission, and therefore income from business? In this situation, a tax audit is not warranted, which means we don't need to go beyond the tax rate and the section under which has been deducted and look at the actual nature of the income. One may receive a notice from the CPC regarding non-filing of tax audit report, and the issue must be resolved by producing the right evidence and convincing the tax authorities that this assessee is not in profession, but is only in business. Of course, the other way of looking at it is, if you want to avoid hassles with the CPC and also probably want to charge a little more income, income from the client, you might as well do the tax audit and give them a tax audit report. Nothing prevents you from doing a tax audit. But I think even in the tax audit, the nature of business, we should clearly mention it as business and not profession. Because if we put there as profession, then tomorrow, in the case of any other thing, it will be very difficult to prove that it is business. So where it asks about the nature of business, let us very clearly state that it is business and not profession. Applicability of professional income. Gross receipts more than 50 lakhs, 44AB is definitely applicable. It is less than or equal to 50 lakhs, then if it is the individual HU of a firm and they are able to declare 50% as net profit, then obviously they don't have to do an audit. And if they're showing if they're showing less than 50%, an audit is applicable. And if they're showing more than 50% of the gross receipts as net profit, then an audit is not required. Now, presumptive tax. Let us take a little look at presumptive tax before we carry on with the rest of the session. I think if one opts to go under presumptive tax to avoid doing a tax audit, one needs to be very careful. Just because you have declared a profit more than the specified percentage, be it 6% or 8% or 50%, does it make the assessee safe? If let us say somebody has 1.5 crores turnover and they have declared 10% of that 15 lakhs as the income. As long as you declare 8%, it is more than sufficient. No question will be asked and will be over. But out of the 1.5 crores, if they have actually earned a profit of 60, 70 lakhs, but they are only declaring 15 lakhs, and the remaining amount they are using after payment of tax to build assets, I think tomorrow the department will have the right to question them. Because the section itself says that you will declare 6 or 8% or such other higher amount as may be earned by you in the business. I think it will be an extremely difficult situation to prove asset building through a presumptive taxation methodology, and therefore one has to exercise care when you choose presumptive tax over tax audit for your clients. These are the reporting forms. We are all familiar with it. A Form 3CA if the books are audited under any other law, Form 3CB if the books are audited only under the income tax law, and Form 3CD statement of particulars. I want to spend a little time on 3CB. While 3CB is essentially for non-corporates. Now the question that I want to ask is, Form 3CB alone sufficient, or do we have to issue another audit report for the non-corporate in addition to Form 3CB? SA 700 talks about audit report. It says even for a non-corporate, we need to issue a tax audit report. For a minute, let us forget income tax. We are doing the audit of a non-corporate. Do we issue an audit report? There is an illustration 4 in the SA 700. Please look at that illustration. It is an illustration 4 and 5 are for non-corporates. Now, all auditing standards are mandatory on the member. They may not be mandatory for anybody else, but it is mandatory for the member. Just as all accounting standards are mandatory for us. While Companies Act talks about mandatory accounting standards, there is no accounting standard which is mandatory for the non-corporates by any statute in the country. But the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India have said that any member attesting the financial statements of a person shall ensure that he has complied with accounting standards. Which means if I am going to sign the financials of a non-corporate, I must ensure that the auditee has complied with accounting standards, and if they have not, I need to put that in my notes and qualify it or express an opinion on that. So this is mandated by our law, by our institute, and therefore to that extent, we need to be very, very clear when we audit a non-corporate. We need to give at least a one-page audit report where we talk about the responsibility of the management, we talk about auditor's responsibility, and then we talk about the opinion. Please look at illustration 4 and 5 in SA 700, adopt them. Maybe you can take away some of the points there, but I think it is very, very essential, because tomorrow, again under peer review, they will say, why have you signed the financials of a non-corporate without an audit report? Now, when we sign a financial or non-corporate, what do we say? Do we say as per report attested, annexed? If we are signing blindly, then what are we saying? So to that extent, a non-corporate, also an audit report is a must, and the notes on account is also a must. Please let us get into the habit to avoid complications in future. Do we have to sign does the assessee have to sign the 3CD? It's a $1 billion question. Most of us, I don't think, spend enough time on getting the 3CD to be signed by the assessee. I think it is very, very important that we should get it signed by the assessee, because the 3CD is supposed to be prepared by the assessee. It is his responsibility to prepare. We are only attesting that the particulars contained in 3CD are true and correct. While we say it is true and fair in the case of financial statements, in fact, in 3CB you have both. First paragraph we say that the financial statements are true and fair, and in the second paragraph we say the particulars contained in Form 3CD are true and correct. So when we are only attesting it, the 3CD is supposed to be prepared by the assessee. Just like the financial statements are supposed to be prepared by the auditee, and we only audit. That is why, in fact, we say in the management responsibility paragraph, we say it is their responsibility. So you necessarily have to get the 3CD signed by the assessee. In fact, the ICA guidance note is very clear. It says it must be attested by the assessee and then only you should sign it. It does not even say you can sign it and then get the signature. Just like we will get the financial statement signed by the auditee first and then sign it. Similarly, a 3CD should be attested by us only after the assessee signs. This is especially true in these days, in the modern era of digital signatures. Forget the guidance note of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India on tax audit for a minute. Tomorrow, if there is a problem between you and your auditee or the assessee, there is something wrong, the income tax department comes up with a big demand, he will go to the department and say, I don't know anything about any of these things. My auditor only prepared the books. My auditor only prepared the financials. He only filed the 3CD. I have nothing to do. Even if you are able to argue that he has accepted the 3CD filed by you, if you look at it deeply, you file the 3CD at 5:25 p.m. on a particular date, and it was accepted by him on 5:27 because it was accepted by you in your office using his digital signature. This is the dangerous situation that we are putting ourselves in. So please ensure that he signs the 3CD physically. Without this, you could have a problem. We have a case in the disciplinary committee today, not with regard to 3CD, but after the entire thing was filed where he expected a refund, where the department gave a refund. He took the refund, as he took the refund, and they happily enjoyed it. 1 year later, it was picked up for scrutiny assessment, and in the scrutiny assessment, they slapped a huge demand on him. At that point of time, the auditee went to the department and said, I know nothing about any of these things. This is not prepared by me. It was prepared only with the auditor. 3CD also was filed with the auditor. And the department immediately has made a complaint to the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India, and the ICA disciplinary committee is seized of this matter. I am really, really scared of these days because today the department is actually very, very trigger happy. They want to file more and more cases against the chartered accountants. So let's not give them one more reason for putting a case against us. Let us at least do these simple things. Get the 3CD signed before you upload the 3CD. This is just 1 minute I want to spend on this. If this penalty is, as we all know, 0.5% of the total sales or total turnover or gross receipts in the case of profession, or 1.5 lakhs, whichever is lower. It's a very straightforward section. But let me tell you, this penalty is only discretionary. The language used in section 271B is may and not the word shall. And hence, if there is a genuine reason, the same reason can be cited with necessary documentation and evidence, and the penalty avoided. In fact, in the last 2 years, there was a case of a very big audit firm in the country, which had obviously goofed up or forgotten that they had to file the tax audit report of a client of theirs. When they finally woke up at the morning of the client, it was the last day, that was the last day, and by the time they uploaded return, it was 10 minutes past midnight. However, they uploaded it, went to the CBDT, represented that was a technical problem and therefore they could not upload it before 12 midnight, and got the CBDT to say yes, it was a technical error and therefore penalty should not be levied. So it is possible to get the penalty waived if there is a genuine reason, because the word used in the section, the language used is may and not shall. It is our responsibility. We need to be a fair judge. We need to assist the assessee by getting all legitimate claims, by making proper clarification and disclosure wherever necessary. But we also need to be fair to the department, to the government and the department. If there is something that needs to be disclosed, I think we need to disclose it without fear of the assessee or losing the client. I just want to read through or take you through few observations made by the Comptroller and Auditor General of this country, the CAG. In a report in the year 2014, where they have stated, we found cases where CAs failed to report full and correct information, leading to short levy of taxes of 2,813 crores. That's a huge figure. I don't think if if the salaries of all of us put together will not reach that, but then it's a huge figure. They did not stop just at one line. They said tax auditors failed to give correct information relating to allowance of depreciation. Tax auditors did not report correct information regarding brought forward loss depreciation, resulting in irregular brought forward loss and depreciation allowance. In 42 cases, personal capital expenditure was incorrectly allowed, as the tax auditors did not report the same in their tax audit reports. CAs have certified wrong information claims for various exemptions and reductions. CAs have given incorrect, incomplete information in tax audit reports. We found another 616 cases where CAs committed mistakes in allowance and exemptions. To improve the quality of work done by the CAs, we recommend referring the cases of professional negligence to the ICAI. CAG is recommending that members of our profession should be taken to task by the Income Tax Department and reported to the ICAI for disciplinary action. This is a report which is 6 years back, when there was, when people of this country respected the CA profession very highly. I'm not saying that the citizens of this country don't respect the profession today, but today, the minute something goes wrong with any corporate, the first question or the first report is, what were the auditors doing? Right from the Prime Minister and Finance Minister of the country to the anchor of the TV channel, that's the only thing they talk about. And therefore, they will all be very, very happy to hang one of us. And let us not be in that group. And let us see that we do a fairly responsible job where we are fair both to the assessee and to the government and report what needs to be reported. Let us not try and safeguard the clients at our own risk. We all know it is a complex thing. If you don't complete within time, there's a penalty. If it is a voluminous transaction. But then completing the tax audit within time with a huge kind of volume, can we year after year cry saying that this is the problem, we are not unable to do it and therefore our quality is suffering? Every year we make a hue and cry asking for the date to be extended. In fact, this morning I was told that people have already started asking for an extension for this year. Given the fact that all the ROCs in the country have extended the AGM, this is the next step. The next step forward is, I would, to be very honest, I'd be very, very happy if the tax audit date is extended this year, because it's really, really going to be a nightmare if you have to complete it. But then why is it that we have never looked at making tax audit easier? Why is it that we have not spent time with our clients who all have accounting softwares today? And most of these accounting softwares today are capable of handling tax deduction at source. See, one of the biggest things that we need, or the most complex, the most time-consuming thing in the tax audit, is checking whether tax has been deducted at source properly, because there are huge volumes. Why is it that none of us have sat in the last week of March or the first week of April with the client in all these years and revamp their entire tally or whatever software they're using to build it? It may take 4 or 5 days, but I think we need to do that, because we all need to understand that our clients don't have a qualified accounting team, in the sense they don't have a chartered accountant at the head of the accounting team. They all have either experienced accountants or semi-qualified accountants who really may not be aware of the complexities of law and the ever-changing legal system in this country. So to that extent, I think we need to. It is not easy. Of course, I will also admit that I have not done it with all my clients. There are some clients for whom we have done it. For every expenditure head and for every vendor, we can build an automatic TDS deduction in the software. And we can use the auditors. I think auditors, there is a login for an auditor in the software. All we need to do is set a system of security. And if we are able to do that with our login ID, if we do the audit for 1 month or 1 quarter and lock it, nobody can change the record. And even if it is changed with a supervisory password, there will be a track or an audit log of who changed and what got changed. The minute they enter an expenditure, automatically TDS is triggered. So this is something which we can do to make life easier for us. I think we should seriously look at why we have not done it, and if possible, do it. In fact, I keep telling my partners, why don't we do it even if it is not chargeable? Because it will make life easy for us. Instead of wasting so much time in the month of September trying to gather so much of information, if we spend 2 or 3 days in each client's office, we will reap the benefit of the next couple of years where the time that we spend on a tax audit will automatically come down. And therefore, I think we should definitely look at every software has it. At least the popular ones all have it. If your client is in an ERP, it will definitely be possible to do it. It should already be available. I would then look at dependence on statutory audit, SA 600. SA 600 is using the work of another auditor. If you're only the tax auditor, then you can rely on the work of the other auditor as per SA 600, provided there are no apparent material misstatements. So you have a case where you are not the statutory auditor, the private limited company has been audited by somebody, you're only doing the tax audit. You can place reliance on the work done by the other auditor, provided apparently there are no mistakes in the material misstatements in the financials. Examples, I want to give you examples of what you cannot rely on. Let us say cash loan from directors have been received and have been squared up during the year. And the statutory auditor of the private limited company has not disclosed them under related party transactions. If he had done his job properly, he should have disclosed it in related party transactions. He has not disclosed it. But during the course of your review of the books of accounts, you find that there are cash loans from directors squared up. Can you take the stand that because he has not disclosed it in related party transactions, I have not disclosed in 3CD? You cannot. It's not possible. Only to the extent that you can rely on the other auditor's work can you rely on, and nothing more. You are duty bound to report it and cannot take shelter under the work of another auditor. Similarly, amounts to be disallowed, not properly done by statutory auditor in computation of income. You also have the computation of income prepared by the company, audited by the statutory auditor, which is what gives them the amount to be provided for. You find that there are certain disallowances, there are certain amounts which should have been deducted, not deducted. Personal nature, capital nature, whatever the deductions are. In your opinion, the statement of computation of income is not right because there are certain deductions which should not have been allowed, which have been allowed, or certain deductions have been wrongly allowed. Can you take shelter of the fact that the provision was made by the auditor? I did not look at the computation statement. I don't think you can take that stand. You still have to necessarily disclose it in the audit report wherever it needs to be disclosed. Another example, he has in his Caro report stated that all statutory dues have generally been remitted to the tax to the authorities in time. Now, generally remitted is a very, very vague statement. In fact, the guidance note of the Institute of Chartered Accountants on Caro talks about 4 different situations. It says you can say they were regular only if all the 12 months, the ESI, the PF, and whatever has been paid correctly. Just because he has stated in Caro that it has been paid correctly, can you take the stand and not disclose it? You still have to disclose the date on which it was due and the date on which it was paid. And if there is a delay, you will have to argue that since it has been paid before the due date of filing of the return, it is allowed as per the judicial pronouncements in case there is a notice issued to you. But you cannot shy away from the fact that it need not be reported because he has not reported it in Caro. These are instances where you cannot rely on the work of another auditor and take shelter under SA 600. You need to be clear that SA 600 gives you shelter only when there are no material misstatements, and not reporting in related party disclosure is a material misstatement. I won't call it a misstatement, it is a material deviation. And to that extent, we need to be very clear that we can rely on the work of an auditor only to the extent possible. We need to do substantive tests and then conclude the audit. But do we have to do a substantive test in all cases, or can we do a compliance testing and then do a substantive testing? Example, let us take TDS checking. In stat audit, we may do a compliance check for TDS deducted, and if the deviation is not material, we may even ignore it. But in tax audit, you do a compliance testing of TDS unless, as I told you, if you have it inbuilt into the software, the internal controls, it take we take a few expenses upon, let's say we take rent, we take contract expenses, we take security services, we take professional charges and do a compliance testing for 3 months. And we find that every time an amount has been debited toward a TDS. In fact, that's why sometimes, I am very appreciative of the bigger companies. Irrespective of the amount, they deduct TDS from rupee 1. They don't go into 30,000 rupees, it is allowed. All that they just throw to the winds. After all, it is instead of paying advance tax, the ASSI is going to be paying TDS. Why not? Maybe not possible in all our clients' cases, but we need to look at whether that can be introduced. And if that works well, then even the compliance testing is enough for TDS checking, in my opinion, even in the case of a tax audit. But if it is not to that extent, we certainly need to do a substantive testing. We need to review judicial pronouncements if relevant. For example, provision for warranty has been made. Now, provision for warranty, the minute you include the provision for warranty, the department will add it back. But there are enough judicial cases to say that provision for warranty is allowed, provided it is based on historical facts and on a sampling methodology. Based on the previous year's experience, if it has been done, scientifically worked out, it is to be allowed. So we add that and look at the judicial pronouncement. Delayed payment of EFPSI. Today, the department, even with a 1-day delay, adds it to income and taxes. But there are several cases where, as long as it is paid before due date, there are a few cases against the ASSI also, but there are several judgments by high courts where it is in favor of ASSI. We need to take that and argue with. I don't think we should avoid putting something in the tax audit report for fear of litigation of our profession. Be something in the tax audit report which will lead to a litigation. So be it. We need to defend ourselves and our clients by quoting the right issues. Importance of management representation letter. I think it's a very, very important document. I don't think we all cry in bank. But let's be honest and ask ourselves, from how many of our non-bank clients do we get a management representation letter? I'll tell you a simple case. Clause 9B of the tax audit report. And I want you a copy of the tax audit report. What does clause 9B say? Clause 9B says, is there a change in the partners or members or in their profit sharing ratio since the last day of the preceding year? If so, the particulars of such change. Now, how do I know that the partnership deed has been changed or not unless I get a MRL? I can ask for the partnership deed to see it. They will give me a copy of the same partnership deed they gave to me last year. Unless they say this is the one and we have not made any changes during the year as an affirmative statement in the MRL, how will I know that they have not done it? Again, I'm going to quote a case. There was a partnership firm which had 5 brothers or 7 brothers, I'm not sure about the numbers. And one of the clause in the partnership deed said, in the event of the death of any of the partners, their wives or the widow will be automatically admitted to the partnership. One of the brothers died and the wife was admitted as a partner. The partnership deed provided for salary to all the partners and a share of profit to all of them. Now, at the end of the year in which this change took place, the partner dying and his wife coming in, the 4 brothers or the 6 brothers in the meeting between themselves said, why should we pay the widow? Because she is not taking part in the day-to-day operations of the firm, and therefore we don't need to pay her salary. They told the auditor that, and the auditor did not, and they did not provide for an account. The auditor agreed with it, signed off. You know what that lady did? The lady went to the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India and complained against that auditor, saying he has been negligent in his duties. He has not read the partnership deed correctly. I'm not talking about a case being filed with the department, the income tax department or the GST authorities. I'm talking about a case being filed by a housewife who is a very clever lady, in my opinion. She has gone and filed a complaint, and it is now before the disciplinary committee of the Institute of Chartered. What will happen Will the chartered accountant be able to absorb himself is a different matter. We could have avoided all this if we had taken the MRL. Have we taken the MRL? 2. Have we really looked at the partnership deed, or have we looked at the previous year's computation and paid salary? And not paid salary. Have we attested the salary paid to the partners by looking at the previous year's records, or have we looked at the partnership deed, which is what we should look at? This is evidence gathering. If we have not gathered the evidence, I think we'll put ourselves in risk. Management representative is a definite must. Let us agree, let us resolve that we will start getting it from today, so that we are safe if it comes to a problem with the ICAA tomorrow. Forget getting into problem with the income tax department. ICAA is the biggest that I am worried about. It is a mental trauma if you are pulled up by the disciplinary committee. And if you talk to some of the central council, will tell you the number of cases that is coming up. They have literally doubled or tripled in the last 3-4 years. So it is time that we pulled up our socks and ensured that we do what is expected of us. What does the peer reviewer look for? He looks for compliance with technical standards, accounting standards, auditing standards, and ICDS. Because let me be very clear, ICDS is not a standard to be adopted for the purpose of books. It is only a computation and disclosure standard. It has nothing to do with the books of accounts. But then the peer reviewer might look at this ICDS also to find out whether if there is a deviation between the accounting standard and the ICDS, have you reported that in the 3CD? So to that extent, he will look. Now, how do I demonstrate compliance with accounting standards? I think we need to have a checklist for all the accounting standards with remarks column saying either this is applicable to them, not applicable. If it is applicable, which note have you referred to it? Which clause in the tax audit report has this particular accounting standard been referred to? As far as the auditing standards are concerned, we can't have a checklist, but we need to demonstrate it by our copious notes, working notes that we have, and the evidence that we've drawn, and how do we dispose of the audit queries. Those are things that we need to look at. Office administration is also something we will look at. He will look at whether you maintained a permanent file and a working file. Do you have a system where you have certain points which are to be carried over to the next year, noted down in the file at the last point of the audit closing? Do you have a system of retrieval, archival retrieval in your office? Do you have a system of preserving these records for 7 years? These are the things that a peer reviewer will look for in office administration. Now, when does this period of 7 years start? If today you are signing, today is the 8th of September. If today you are signing the financials of auditee for the year ended 31st of March 2019, the 7-year period starts from today and not 31st of March 2019. So from the day you sign, you have to keep those records for a minimum period of 7 years. Please ensure that it is done. Training program for staff, much has been spoken about it. How far we have been able to succeed in doing that in spite of the various seminars being conducted for them by the SICASA committee of the various branches. Are we able to select the right horse, as they say in English, the horses for the courses? Do we send our senior most person to do the audit, a tax audit of a big corporate that we do or a big non-corporate that we do? Do we have the first year students doing vouching, or do we have the first year student going and doing a tax audit or a corporate audit? While it is very easy to talk about it, it is difficult. But I think we need to certainly have more and more staff training in addition to what is being done by the branch to ensure that they are trained well. And we also need to have a system where a mid-audit review is conducted by one of the partners or by the sole proprietor himself. And during the course of this review, if he finds that the article clerks and audit staff have not been going the right path, make those corrections. The peer reviewer will look for how were the queries raised by the audit staff been handled or disposed by you. Were there any unsolved queries or unsolved material queries? If so, what actions or disallowances were done on the or disclosures were done on the same? Peer reviewer will look at these things. He will look at your work paper. We will look at the unsolved queries. We will look at why for the unsolved queries there is no note in your audit report or your tax audit report. Please look at that. Unfortunately, again, I would only like to say that this is a recorded meeting and I cannot tell you something more than what I can tell you in prayer. But you need to be careful with your working papers. You need to have working papers, and maybe sometimes you don't need to have your working papers. You need to be judicious about it. Please ensure that your working papers are in order. These are the standards and regulations that one has to follow. Again, ICDS and accounting standards, auditing standards, general clarifications and interpretations given by the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India and other authorities, guidance notes, code of ethics, and relevant legislations. These standards and regulations are applicable to both financial audit and tax audit. While all of us look at the compliance of accounting standards, we often tend to lose sight of the requirements of auditing standards. The Companies Act 2013 has made auditing standards also mandatory for corporates. Thus, if you are doing sample checking to test controls, we need to follow SA 500. I'm taking a very simple, small standard. All of us do test check. All of us do sample check. Are we reading SA 500? Have we read SA 500 and doing sampling based on that? Or do we tell our article, you please do 3 months bank reconciliation, check 3 months back reconciliation, or look at something haphazard. Have we looked at SA 500? SA 500 says audit sampling enables the auditor to obtain and evaluate audit evidence about some characteristics of the line item selected in order to form an opinion. Audit sampling can be applied using either non-statistical or statistical sampling approaches, which means SA 500 allows us to use non-sampling methodology also, non-statistical methodology also. What is a statistical sampling? What are the kind of statistical sampling we can use? We can use random sampling. We can use probability sampling. We can use a systematic selection and random selection. We can use monetary unit sampling, which means we go by the value. If we take purchases, we say we need samples to cover 75% or 80% of the total samples. We can fix a limit. We can say beyond this amount, we will look at all invoices. Below this amount, we will do a sample. We can arrive at any kind of sampling that we want. But we need to document the basis of arriving at the sample and should demonstrate to the peer reviewer that we have followed that. Even a haphazard selection is sometimes allowed. In fact, the SA 500 says haphazard selection is one where the auditor selects a sample without following a structured technique. Although no structured technique is used, the auditor would nonetheless avoid any conscious bias or predictability. The standard goes on to say haphazard selection is not appropriate when using statistical sampling. So when you're doing non-statistical sampling, haphazard testing is also allowed. There are several sampling standards and sampling metrics that have been defined by the SA 500. How many of us are aware of it? I think we need to be aware of it. We need to look at those sampling. That's why I said, I think we need to have a workshop for auditing standard where we don't talk theory, we talk practically. It's something which I've been telling every branch in the last 4 years. Unfortunately, the minute I say auditing standard, all of us say, sir, nobody will come up with an auditing standard. So it has never been conducted. I think we need to do that. Yes, I have myself addressed workshop on auditing standards conducted over a period of 3 days. Invariably, what happens is speaker after speaker stands up and talks theory after theory. Dry, the participants are not able to assimilate. I think frankly, if I was to attend a seminar, for me the takeaway will be, what is it that I can practically do instead of just listening to theory? So that is the reason why I think we should hold those things. Let us look at the auditing standards which have relevance to tax audit. SA 230. In fact, in this slide and in the next slide, I have listed out 6 auditing standards which I feel are of paramount importance while conducting a tax audit. SA 230 audit documentation. We will look at that in a little more detail in the report of the next few slides. SA 300. Planning and audit of financial statement. That is the standard. In this SA, we certify it as true and fair. In tax audit corporates, we certify the 3CD is correct, true and correct. may entail a more detailed analysis of certain ledger accounts. Non-corporates which certify both true and fair and true and correct. In the case of non-corporates, in my opinion, it will be best to do the two audits together. Why should we do a financial audit now and a tax audit later? Can't I do both together? That is what I should do. In fact, I personally feel that we should do the tax audit and the GST audit along with the financial audit. Otherwise, we will land ourselves in a soup later on. If after doing the financial audit and certifying it as true and correct, we suddenly find when we're doing the GST audit that an invoice has been missed out or ITC has been wrongly taken, which has a material impact, then we are definitely going to find us in the soup, because the amount that has been missed out might actually warrant a liability to be created that should have been created, we have not paid. So at least 75 to 80% of the GST audit and 75 to 80% of the tax audit should be completed before we sign the financials. Let us look at SA 300. Let us plan our audit accordingly and look at it. SA 320 talks about materiality in planning and performing an audit. This standard, unlike many other standards, runs to only 10 pages. All other auditing standard runs to 20 pages, 25 pages, 30 pages. This auditing standard runs to only 10 pages. I urge all of you to read if you have not already done so. What are the requirements of the standard? The audit documentation should include the following amounts and the factors considered in their determination. A, materiality for the financial statements as a whole, which means this standard says you must fix the materiality for the financial statements as a whole. 2, if applicable, the materiality level or levels for particular classes of transactions, for example, account balances or disclosure, debtors alone or assets, liability alone. If you want to set separate materiality at those levels, at the classification levels, then that also needs to be set under this standard. Performance materiality. Are you going to look at performance materiality? Then you need to look at a materiality to be fixed according to the standard. And if there's any revision in all these three that we said, again, if it is, if the audit is progressing, if there is a change, we need to look at materiality again. But generally, I would, in my personal opinion, think that in the case of small and medium clients that we handle, a general 5% of the net profit might be a very good materiality concept. We can look at that. Having said that, let me also warn you, it is only my recommendation, which is what I follow in quite a few of our clients' cases, but there are also cases where we don't follow that because it is not really indicative of materiality, and therefore you need to look at it. But if you are generally doing a manufacturing or trading organization, I think the 5% of the net profit is a fairly right ratio. Also, if the client has been having a seasonal thing, there has been a profit 1 year, loss 1 year, again profit 1 year, then you might want to take the average of the last 3 years of net profit and then take 5% of that as the materiality. What I only want to say is you consider materiality. Materiality is something to be decided by the auditor and the auditee. Nobody else can tell you what it is. Please document how you arrive at the materiality. If you're taking 5%, please document it. Say why you have chosen. Have a reason why you have chosen that as the right materiality. Demonstrate to the peer reviewer that this is sufficient materiality and you have done it based on this materiality fixed between you and the client. SA 500. Let us keep in mind the requirements of SA 500, audit evidence, and SA 580, written representation, and SA 600, using the work of another auditor. These are three standards which we certainly need to keep in mind. SA 580 we've already looked at. SA 600 also we have already looked at. But may I also draw your attention to SA 510. What does SA 510 talk about? SA 510 talks about initial audit engagements, opening balances. Which means we have an auditing standard which tells us how to verify opening balances. If you are carrying out the audit for the first time, after obtaining the no objection certificate from the previous auditor, you may want to look at this standard, SA 510, because this standard tells you the document, the process by which you must verify opening balances if you are doing the audit for the first time. Therefore, I think you might want to read this auditing standard if you're doing the audit for the first time. This is nothing but a comparison between the ICDS and the accounting standards. I don't want to go into deep depth into this, except to tell you that construction contract between ICDS and accounting standard, there will certainly be a variation, because ICDS talks only about percentage of completion method, while the comparable accounting standard allows you to also choose a completed contract method. There will be a deviation, which means that deviation must be reported by you in your tax audit report. Second, service revenue recognition. Again, revenue recognition, service revenue recognition as per ICDS talks about only percentage of completion method unless it is a very short-term contract. But the accounting standard talks about a completed contract method. Even there, again, there will be a deviation. Please look at these two. There are also a deviation in terms of securities. ICDS 8 versus AS 13, where AS 13 allows for a global set-off. For example, if you have equity shares, you have debentures, you have preference shares, and the closing value you arrive at the end of the year value you arrive at, you can add up all of them and look at which is lower, cost or market value which is lower. But in the case of securities, ICDS, it says you must look at each of them separately and take the lower bit in that group and not do it on a global basis. Again, this is also something which will have a deviation. Please look at least more or less, otherwise more or less the ICDS and the accounting standards are more or less right, except the fact that ICDS does not have fundamental assumptions. They don't talk about concept of prudence. There is no materiality in ICDS. These are three things that may certainly come to my mind, immediately comes to my mind, and I think we should definitely look at that before we, and disclose it properly. If there is a deviation, disclose it in the tax audit report before we sign off the tax audit report. Applicability to Udemy, I think by now we are all clear that it is required and we need to generate it. I don't even think we should use the window of 15 days available, because after all, if you are signing off and uploading the return on the last day, what prevents us from generating the Udemy? It is not as if we can generate it later, backdate it, sign it, and then upload it. Today the law has changed. It has to be uploaded by the last date. Not enough if the SC obtains the report. Those 3 days are gone. So we need to do this. Please let us not forget to generate this. In fact, I want to emphasize that we should do it on the same day, because we might tend to forget. There was a seminar held recently by SIRC where the officials of the income tax department, especially the CPC, came and spoke about, where they were going to, they spoke about 2.0, CPC 2.0 being launched, where one of the presenters, I think it was an additional commissioner or a deputy commissioner who said that, who spoke about the new software that is going to be launched on 1st October. He said the Udemy will be checked live. As you upload, they will check for the Udemy. And then he went on to say, we understand that your institute has given you a time frame, so you need to come back and fill it up. If you don't fill it up within the time frame that is allowed by the CA Institute, the form that you have submitted, which does not carry Udemy, will be summarily rejected. So this is one other thing which we need to understand, keep in mind, and ensure that we generate Udemy, if possible, on the same day or at least the next day, and go back to the income tax site and feed in. What is the audit documentation? Audit documentation is nothing but the record of audit procedures performed. What is the procedure I performed? What are the relevant audit evidence that I obtained? What are the conclusions I reached based on the evidence? This is all audit documentation about. We make a big hue and cry about audit documentation. Very simple. What did I ask my audit clerks to do? That is the audit procedure. What did they do? And what are the evidence they gathered? Whether it be a screenshot of the software, or is it a photocopy of an agreement, or a soft copy of an invoice, whatever it is, those are all evidences. And then based on that evidence and the process continued, what sampling did they do? Based on all this, what are the conclusions reached? In other words, what we need to actually ask is what work was done and by whom was it done? If we are able to record that in our working notes, general ledger review, who did it? What are their findings on general ledger review? What are the queries that are disposed of? What are the queries disposed of by them, by the audit team itself, and why? How did they dispose of? What are the queries that was posted to us at our level, and how did we dispose them of? If we are able to demonstrate that to the peer reviewer, I don't think we should have a problem at all. Who reviewed the work? It is not enough if you have an audit document which says audit queries are all done by the audit team. Let us for a minute not forget that most of our audit teams is not headed by a chartered accountant. Unlike the big four or the big firms in India, where there is an audit manager, there is an audit lead, an audit manager, a signing partner. All three of them are chartered accountants. So it passes through 3 layers. Whereas in most of our cases, the only layer, professional layer, is us. The buck stops with us. Therefore, we need to do a review, a mid-course review if possible, and note it down in our audit working papers. What decision was taken? And by whom was the decision taken? What is the conclusion for the decision taken? After the decision, was it decided to disclose it? Or if it does not warrant disclosure, why does it not warrant disclosure? Have we looked at all that? Have we recorded that? For example, clause 21A of the 3CD report. And I would like to read what clause 21A of the 3CD report talks about. 21A1. 21A1 talks about expenditure of a capital nature. I have done the audit of a private limited company. The accounting policy for property, plant and equipment followed by the auditee of the private limited company is any asset costing less than 10,000 rupees will be expensed with the year of purchase. So they expended. But for the purpose of computation of income, I have added back the depreciation as per books and computed the depreciation as per income tax act, wherein I have taken this amount and added as part of addition to fixed assets and claimed the depreciation as per the income tax act. But the fact remains that the capital expenditure is still debited to the profit and loss. The question is, capital expenditure debited to profit and loss. The guidance not issued by the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India does not give us any guidance on this. In a situation like this, do I disclose it there or don't I disclose it? I have made the computation correct because I have excluded from depreciation in books. It has gone totally to my P&L as 100% depreciation. Therefore, I have added back the depreciation, and in the tax audit, in the income tax depreciation, I have calculated at the rate which applies to that asset costing less than 10,000. So there is no loss to revenue. I have done it correctly. But the question is, have capital expenditure been debited to P&L? And our guidance note says, anytime you find capital expenditure debited to P&L, please list them here. If I list them there, the artificial intelligence and CPC will add it back immediately. What do I do? That is the question. I think the safest thing would be not to disclose it in the 3CD, but have an explanation as to why we have not done it. We have done everything else correctly, but we have not done it. Is that what we need to do? If I was going to do that, that is what I would do. Because the minute I add it, it will automatically get added with the CP, and then I'll have to go into litigation trying to explain why and the what of that. I hope the ICA comes up with a better guidance on that. They only say, please list it. They have not gone into the concept of income tax depreciation. It has been correctly added, and it has been removed from the depreciation table in the books. All that they have not looked at, or maybe maybe I am making a mountain of a molehill. But I think there's something which we need to look at. Document whatever decisions we come to. Please remember one thing: a peer reviewer cannot fault your judgment. He can fault your process. If after considering all the evidences and your interpretation of the law as you understand it, if you come to a decision, he cannot question that decision. As long as you have document to prove that this is the way I arrived at a decision and that is why I did not disclose it, I don't think he can find fault with you. But if you say I did not disclose it because I did not disclose it, that is not enough. That is not sufficient. That's why I'm saying for every point of disclosure or a non-disclosure, have a system where you have something to be documented. It's very simple. SA 230. The primary objective of SA 230 is to have audit documentation based on which you prepare the audit report. It also provides evidence of the audit plan and perform. So I don't think there's much to go into that. The key features of SA 230 we will look at. What are the nature, timing, and extent of audit procedures performed? What are the results? You did a sampling. You took a sample of 50 vouchers. of, let us say, contract. There are lots of contract being given out. So you took 50 vouchers out of 1,500 vouchers, and you looked at, what did you look at those 50 vouchers? You looked at whether TDS has been done properly. You looked at, whether the payment has been done as per the contract terms and conditions agreed to. You looked at whether something that should have been disallowed, all these things. Out of the 50 that you did not find a deviation in more than 1 or 2 cases. Are you happy with the compliance testing? Do you need to do a standard testing? This is what needs to be. And then, what is the audit evidence that you had a dispute or you had a discrepancy in 1 or 2 of the vouchers that you saw? But then they give you further additional evidence. Based on those evidences, you concluded that this right, what conclusion you came to was wrong, and the query was right. But then, since they have given you additional evidence, there is no need to go on further. Please record all this. Yes, it means spending more time. But I think if we don't have time, at least we need to train our articles or dictate to them so that they write it down and then we sign off. Significant professional judgment has to be made in the case of any of the audit evidence that we get. Evidence is the information that is used by the auditor in arriving at a conclusion. The auditor's opinion is based on the evidence. It must be relevant. It must be, it must be reliable. It must be relevant. It include both information contained in the accounting records and also other information. And when I talk about other information, if we are doing the audit of corporates, let us also, I know I'm digressing a little from the subject. If we are doing the audit of corporates, if there are certain figures in the director's report which has a bearing or which can be cross-checked with the accounts, with the financial statement, please ensure that you do it because you're also responsible for those figures. While you don't have to qualify any of the figures, then you have to state whether those figures are in line with the financial statements. Something which has come in the last 2 years, our comments on non-financial information, and therefore let's be careful about that. Audit evidence decisions of which audit procedure to use. Are you doing a review? Are you doing a deep analysis? Are you doing a ratio analysis? What is it that you're doing for that particular process? What sample size do you choose? What did you select from the population? And when did you perform the procedures? These are the things that will, if you have got notes on each one of these things, I think you will not have a problem facing the peer reviewer. Again, audit evidence must be sufficient, it must be appropriate, it must be relevant, and must be reliable. What do we mean by reliability of audit evidence? This chart lists out the most reliable audit evidence as an external evidence obtained by the auditor. For example, confirmation from the bank, where the confirmation comes directly to you and it is not handed over to the auditor and he comes and gives it to you. That is the most reliable. The second is the external evidence sent by the auditor. This is more in the nature of a negative confirmation. You ask the client to send out letters to, say, all the customers, telling them that as per our books, you owe so much. If you do not dispute it or if you do not confirm within a week or 10 days, we will take it as confirmed. Now, in such a situation, it is more a negative confirmation rather than a positive confirmation. I think you are perfectly valid, slightly lesser in reliability than the other one, but it's still a reliable one. Third, internally generated written evidence. I think the example that I can take to to understand this internally generated written evidence is the date of capitalization of a fixed asset. If you are auditing as a system where they buy, whenever a capital asset is purchased, let us say a machinery, there is a test report that is generated internally. There is a report on the date on which it was, the installation was done. There is a commissioning report signed by both the supplier of the machine and by the representative of auditing. And if these things are kept on record in a fairly decent manner, and today most of the small industries are also doing this as far as capital purchase is concerned, because tomorrow if they have to claim a warranty claim, all these records are required to make a claim against the manufacturer for warranty if something goes wrong in the first 1 year. So it is generated. If these are internally generated, these are definitely internally generated evidence. If the internal controls are strong and you've tested the internal controls, I think you can rely on those internally generated written evidence. The oral evidence is the least reliable. But during the course of your conversation with the auditee or discussion with the auditee, if they give you some evidence, oral evidence, which you find is not against whatever you have seen in the books of accounts, I think there also we can rely on. Again, the only thing is we need to say on such and such a date, we did this, we had a discussion. The crux of this discussion is this, based on this we are at it. In fact, I would go to the extent, I would go one step further and say, please send them a mail that this is what we understood from you during the course of our discussion with you. Please confirm whether our understanding is right. That will see. To give you a very, very simple example, today one of our clients called us, for whom we don't do the audit, but we do some other work. We do compliance testing and things like that. We don't do an audit. We do GST filing for them. So one of our clients called us and said, sir, I don't have any invoices last year. Please file a nil GST, GSTR1. The article came and told me, sir, this is what they told. Can I go ahead? I said, please ask him to send you a mail confirming that they don't have an invoice during raise the month of August. At least a text message or a WhatsApp message followed by a mail. Because tomorrow if he says, I never told them that, you are in a soup. Because this is oral communication. This is a simple thing which probably happens in our offices every day. But that is what, sometimes the simple things that we ignore are the things that can cause us trouble later on. So let us try and get into a culture where, I'm not saying we have to be a police state in our office, but I think we need to be an office where we try and document as much things as possible. If there are doubts over reliability of audit evidence, for example, you ask them, have all the debtors and creditors confirmed the balances? The company says, sir, we sent out letters to all the debtors and all the creditors, totaling about 450 vendors and customers. We have not received a confirmation from even one of them. Then as an auditor, I would ask them to produce to me the evidence of having sent those letters. Because I personally believe, or I definitely believe, that out of 450 letters, at least 10 of them would have replied. If none of them have replied, then there's something seriously wrong. If they are unable to produce proof of having dispatched those 450 letters or 400 emails, then I am put on suspicion. The reliability of the audit evidence is not there. I might have to do further investigation or further test to confirm whether those payables and receivables have been correctly stated. 2. I also find that there are several accounts in payables where balances have not been paid for several months together or several years together. The opening balance of the last 2-3 years is continuing. They claim they have sent letters, nobody is confirming. Why will somebody not confirm that they are owed money by the auditee? If you at least said you owe money to the auditee, they might not confirm. But when you say there is a credit balance in our books due to you, why will he not confirm? That means there is something seriously wrong. Don't you think at this point of time, my skepticism as an auditor should come to the fore? And should I not look at this audit evidence with least reliability and adopt some other measures to find out whether I have comfort for certifying the figures that I certify? These are some of the process for which a management representation letter is a must. I'm not going to read out each clause, but I would like to draw a reference to clause 21A. Again, I think this clause 21A is something which I'm quoting for the third time or fourth time. I don't know why, but there are so many issues in that. Clause 21A seeks the disclosure of personal expenses, while clause 21A4 and A5 warrants the disclosure of club fees debited to profit and loss account. While 21A4 deals with entrance fee and subscription, 21A5 deals with cost of club services and facilities. Should the above expenses be disclosed under these clauses, even if they are not personal in nature? Some of the auditors are taking the stand that clause 21A, and I'm reading to you from the 3 CD that I hold in my hand. 21A, please furnish the details of amount debited to the profit and loss account being in the nature of capital, personal, advertisement expenditure, etc. A1, expenditure of capital nature. A2, expenditure of personal nature. A3, advertisement. 4 is club. 5 is club. Some of the auditors are taking the stand. 21A says, please furnish details of amount debited being in the nature of capital or personal. Therefore, all the other things that they follow also needs to be disclosed only if it is personal. I think one needs to look at the tax audit guidance note. Tax audit guidance note says club fees, even if they are for only business purposes, whether it is entrance fee, which should be reported in 21A4, or subscriptions, or fees for facilities enjoyed in 21A5 should be reported even if they are only business expenditures and not personal expenditure. If it is personal expenditure, the guidance note says it should be reported in 21A1, which talks about 21A2, which talks about expenditure of personal nature. But the problem I have is the minute I put a figure there, CPC will add it. So do I put it there or don't I put it? I don't know. This year I'm going to try a different thing. I am not going to put it there. But I am going to put it as a qualification in my 3CA or 3CB. 3CA and 3CB says, subject to our observations, the particulars contained are true and correct. Why can I not state there as an observation that under so and so clause, this amount should be disclosed as fees, as expenditure incurred at clubs being cost of for club services and facilities used. However, in the opinion of the assessee, they are business expenditure and need not be disclosed there. This is a deviation, and I have pointed out. Am I not safe? The artificial intelligence today looks at only at 3CD. It does not reach the stage where it started looking at 3CA. So I think I might have a solution there. Again, I would like to have the feedback from the members on this. If not, during the course of this webinar, please by mail or a WhatsApp message to me, and let us try and see how we can avoid, avoid unnecessary correspondence with CPC and unnecessary litigation of rectification of order passed by them without, by mechanically adding certain things without reading through the reply that we sent to 143(1)A. They don't read through it and they do it again. I won't blame them. As I again said, when we heard the CPC authority talking about, they have a logic written there. There is an artificial intelligence at work. Therefore, that is how it will be done. But can we look at something to avoid small things like this so that our life will become a little more easier? So this is clause 21A personal expenditure, which I would like to share with you. Then other things for which management representative is required is section 20, clause 28, section 56, clause 32, 32B, 34, special audit 37, 38, 39. We will never know whether special audits have been done, not even pending demands. So all of this, please take an in. It will take 1 hour or 2 hours to form out an MRL for all this. It is a standard template that we can use. And when we talk about standard template, I must tell you that there was a specific request from the chairman asking whether I could share a tax audit checklist with the members. Unfortunately, I have not reached a stage where I can share it with the members. But I would like to assure the chairperson and all the members attending this webinar that within the next week, I will certainly make a very well-drafted, in my opinion, a well-drafted checklist. This job is being attended to by one young chartered accountant who was my article clerk, passed out, became qualified, went and worked in the Big Four, and now in private practice. He has already done a checklist. We need to make certain corrections to it and embellish it. The minute it is ready, me and Arun Kumar, that's his name, we will be more than happy to share it with the Vizag branch. I will certainly mail it to the branch, and the branch can mail it to the concerned members. Please give me 1 more week's time, Chairperson. I told you yesterday when you called that I will certainly have something, but it's not been possible, and I will certainly do it. These are the deficiencies noticed by the peer reviewers. There is no proper system of indexation and cross-referencing in the work. For example, the fixed asset schedule in the financial statements, as I told you, has certain additions, certain deletions. Is the amount that is shown as additions there the same amount shown as additions in the tax audit depreciation schedule? Why is it that there is no cross-indexing? After all, it should be the same. total amount of addition should be the same. Is it not the first thing that I will look at as an auditor? The minute I see property, plant and equipment schedule or the fixed schedule in the case of non-corporate, as we still call it, total additions there during the year should jive with the total additions here. In fact, probably the figure can be, there will be no difference at all. It has to be the same. Why are we not cross-verified, cross-indexed and cross-verified? Our working paper should have that. That is exactly what the peer review is looking for. If you place work on another auditor, where is the proof in your work? You say, I have looked at this, I have seen this, and I have verified. For example, related party disclosure. I have seen that these are the related party disclosures he has listed. I have also looked at the thing. In my mind, in my review, I did not find any material misstatement from the books and the related party disclosure made by the statutory auditor. I have taken the same for the purpose of my disclosure under the tax audit. Renewal of appointment letter is not obtained. Correspondence to the previous auditor before taking the audit, not available. Working paper is not properly organized. If you look at it, there are errors which we can easily correct if we put our mind to it and spend 1 hour for each client's file. This all actually calls for. Again, I think the whole idea is, every time we talk about documenting, we get a little perturbed and we think that it's a huge work. Yes, it is huge work. But I think we need to do it. When we can do a brilliant audit, why is it that we can't do a brilliant documentation? I think it's not come into our blood, as I said. It is not come into us as a part of our culture. And also, I will definitely agree with most of you when you say, but sometimes we are confused as to what constitutes documentation and what does not constitute documentation. And that is why I think we need to definitely discuss this more and more. Get experts to come and talk to us with live examples of what is evidence, what is documentation, what needs to be in the file, and what should not go into the file. If we are able to do all that, we can certainly do a very good, we can certainly have a documentation in addition to a good audit, which will pass the test of the peer reviewer. Evaluation of testing of internal control. I am certifying the internal financial controls are working properly. I am saying that I have relied on the internal control, but where is the proof for having tested the internal financial? Have I done any test at all? If I have done a test, I shouldn't have that. If I can again go to my bank audit, if I say I have tested 5, I have looked at all large advances and some non-large advances. Do I have the name and the account number and the balance outstanding of those small advances that I saw? I can't simply write, I saw 10 small advances. I have to necessarily say, these are the 10 accounts I looked at. And what did I look at? In one case, I looked at credit appraisal. In a few cases, I looked at interest charging, whether it is done properly or not. Unless I have that along with the figures from the bank's ledger, how will I prove to my peer reviewer that I have done that work? Writing that I looked at 100% of the large advances and 10% of the small advances will be meaningless if we don't have particulars about the loans that we looked at. Or do we at least have printed account statements of those things? Similarly, in the case of our tax audit, if you are able to, if you are going to say that we looked at tax payments not exceeding 10,000 rupees, what did you look at? Did you look at the cash book for the whole year? Did you do a filter for amounts more than 10,000 rupees? Did you get a filter and did it throw up? Have you got that as a part of your screenshot of that? Or the screenshot or that particular thing has been exported and converted into PDF, and have you got that? Without that, how will you convince anybody? I mean, how will you convince your own partner that you have done it? You need to have those evidences. Please look at those evidences, see that they are available, and then let's see how we can take it forward. Comes to these are more or less again the same thing. Office administration. If you are the tax advisor for the client, you cannot be the tax auditor. Code of ethics prohibits you from doing it. Because you can be a tax, you can represent them in tax. But if you are giving them tax advice, then you cannot be the tax auditor. That is a clear conflict of the code of ethics. Please ensure that there is nothing, please ensure that you don't do it and see how you can resolve it. Review of independence is critical. Are all the audit members independent of the auditing? Again, a code of ethics issue. You have to ensure that it is done. Document retention and discarding, archival, what is the system you have? What is it that you have? Again, nothing complicated about it. Independence declaration. Do you have a policy of independence? Have you given it to every staff of yours? Have they signed it? Is it available on record? Have they understood what it is? If they have any interest, or if their father or mother have any interest in any authority, they should bring it to your notice. Is what is stated in audit. Have they done that? Do you have it on record? This is what he's going to talk about. This is what the peer reviewer can. See, peer reviewer is not going to do an audit of your auditing. You have already done the audit. He is only going to look at what is the process you follow to look at that. Therefore, you can refer. And if there is some matter for which you need to have consultation with subject experts, have you done that and obtained it? For example, gratuity valuation. Is there an actuarial valuation available? Should you not have a copy of that in your working paper file? Otherwise, how will you convince him that it was done through an actuarial valuation? Those are the things that we essentially need to do. And as we always talk about and always cry about, staff supervision and development is very, very essential. We need to make them understand the latest amendments, understand the impact of latest judicial pronouncements. I know it is easy to say about this, tough to implement it because we don't get the best staff in our offices. We are small and medium practitioners, but witness, either we should have the institute increase the number of meetings done by the SICASA, or sometimes we feel that the SICASA meetings are too big and it doesn't go down, percolate to the articulates who are not very sure of themselves. Maybe smaller meetings within firms, try and develop their understanding, try and develop their knowledge base to ensure that they do as good a job as we would want them to do. Finally, to conclude, I think we need to comply with all accounting standards. Please, when I was doing peer review actively, I've gone into some practice units where they said, sir, none of our clients' accounting standards are compulsory because they are all non-corporates. My question to them would be, it might not be mandatory to them, but as an auditor, as a member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants, if you sign that, if you indulge in any trust function, accounting standards are mandatory for you and you should comply to them. So have they done that? So we need to comply with accounting standards. We need to comply with the auditing standards. By our working note, we must demonstrate that we comply with the auditing standards. We need to do an audit review. Maybe in a small audit, it might not, mid-audit review might not be necessary, but in a slightly larger audit, mid-audit review. Checklist wherever possible. A peer reviewer, in fact, any of the big four or the big firms in India have checklists for everything, including, going from the office to the client's office. There will be checklist for every activity in the office. There is a checklist. And I am told by some of my articlers who, after qualification, have joined the big four, that they're doing so much of documentation. When I ask them, why did you not do the documentation when you were in my office, when I cried, when I asked you, when I begged you, when I threatened you to do it, you never did it? Their answer was, sir, in those firms, if I don't do documentation, I won't get my salary. Here I got it, therefore I didn't do it. The truth is that unless we install a sense of fear in our audit staff that they will be penalized if they don't do documentation, we will never be able to get documentation done. File, index the audit files. You don't, when a peer reviewer comes in, you don't have to give the names of your clients at all. It is enough if you give them code numbers, but please have them documented, index them. And be bold and disclose in 3CD what needs to be disclosed, even if it is not to the liking of the auditee, because that is the only way we can save ourselves from trouble. And finally, I am sure you will all remember that I started off my session with tax audit documentation being a myth. And hopefully, during the course of my presentation, I hope I have pointed out the importance of documentation and why it should not be a myth. One of the definitions of mystique is now on your screen. Mystique means an air of secrecy surrounding a particular activity or subject that makes it impressive or baffling to those without specialized knowledge. While we all have specialized knowledge of accounting and auditing, the same cannot be said about our audit programs, checklists, and documentation. And that is probably the reason why I feel that the entire topic was either a myth or mystique, depending on the perspective of the listener. Let us be clear in our minds that audit documentation should neither be a myth or a mystique, but should become reality and be a part and parcel of our audit process and our working file. Only if it becomes a reality will we be able to defend ourselves against any accusations of negligence or the lack of quality in our audit work. And again, for the second time, let me assure the chairperson that I will certainly send you the checklist that I promised I will have for you. Thank you very much for a very patient hearing. I hope you enjoyed this presentation as much as I enjoyed presenting it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. That was a presentation from your side, sir, on the part of audit documentation. A few of the members has raised their queries in the chat box. If you can access that,
yes.
Otherwise I shall read out.
I'll look at it. I'll stop sharing the share and come back and look at it. One second. Is it in the chat box?
Yes, sir, in the chat box.
There is a question from Venkateshwarlu. Sir, net profit is after depreciation or before depreciation for working NP ratio for income tax purposes? I won't say it is only for income tax purposes. For any materiality, you are looking at net profit after depreciation. It's fairly correct materiality. I don't think there is anything wrong at that. So, unless the depreciation is a huge amount in the first few years of this thing, and therefore it gives you a very skewed result because of the depreciation in the books, then you might want to look at net profit before depreciation. But if it is more or less the same on a year-to-year basis, there is no additional depreciation or things like that which skews it up, and I think even the profit after depreciation will be a good profit level indicator for the purpose of materiality. I am assuming that your question is about materiality. There is a question from Bharat TLN. Sir, an individual SC had the business income had submitted the return for the assessment year 18-19 at 44 AD. For the assessment year 19-20, he had no business income and submitted return for income from other sources only. Now for the assessment year 20-21, he has business income and proposing to submit the return under 44 AD. Can he do so? Or section 44 AD4 and AD5 will come his way, and should he get the books audited? His turnover is always around 70 lakhs. Now, if as I told you, I am not an expert in income tax, but I will try and definitely answer the question. 44 AD and 44 AD4 and AD5 talk about a case where you have been under tax, presumptive tax, but you go out of presumptive tax, declare an income, and then you can't come back into the presumptive tax for the next 5 years. That is my understanding of 44 AD and 4. But if you say that you did not carry on any business at all in the previous year, then you have not gone out of 44 AD, you continue to be under 44 AD, and therefore this should be possible. Having said that, if you can mail this query to me, I would like to have this query answered by my tax partner, so that this will be a benefit to me and also to you. So, Mr. Bharati, if you can kindly mail this to me, it will be of great use to me for my own knowledge updation and for a much wider discussion at a bigger forum.
Sure, sir. Thank you. I will do it.
Sir, the new threshold of 1 crore to 5 crore is applicable to all associates, example, company, firm, and proprietary concern. Yes, for all associates, it is applicable. Even for private limited companies, it is applicable. Just let me look at the chart once more before I confirm that to you. Yes, sir, it is applicable for everybody, is my understanding. It is applicable for this assessment year. Only criteria, there is 5% of cash payment or cash receipts. In 2 or 3 cases that we checked, where we thought it would be less than 5% because most of the sales were done on credit card, they were retail sports good dealers. most of the sales were done through credit cards, and of course their entire purchases were done through net banking, and all their expenses, other than some minor expenses, were done through either net transfers or through check. But we found that it was not 5%, somewhere 7.5%. So we told the client to see that this does not exceed 5%. This was in the case of a private limited company. So that is why we couldn't avoid the tax audit, but otherwise it is definitely applicable to everyone. Sir, this is a question from Suraj. Sir, the new threshold of 1 crore to 5 crore applicable to all assets. This is exactly what the previous question also was. I think the answer is already there. This is one from Mr. C.A. Srinivas Vasa. Sir, in regard to turnover cases between 2 crores to 5 crores threshold limit, where 5% CR and CP satisfied, tax audit not required. Can you clarify 8% minimum profit is not required? Are you trying to combine the two? If it is the 8% will apply only to the extent of turnover not exceeding 2 crores. Beyond 2 crores, you can't go to the presumptive. You have to go by whatever is your books, but you don't need to do a tax audit. You can go up to 2 crores, only up to 2 crores you can say, I don't have books, I have gone under present taxation of 8% or 6%. The minute the turnover crosses 2 crores, you can't come under present taxation. You have to prepare profit and loss account and balance sheet. You need to maintain books of accounts. You need to prepare profit and loss account, balance sheet, and submit to the authorities. The only thing is, you don't need to do a tax audit if the cash receipts and cash payments are not in excess of 5%.
So members, if there are any further questions are there, you can unmute yourself and ask the speaker.
Oh, is this meeting supposed to go on till 7 o'clock?
No, sir, it's only till 6:30.
Oh, okay. 6:16, 6:30 we're supposed to close.
Only till 6:30, sir. So members, I think no more doubts. Sir, as you said, sir, as you said, the last moment rush, the client will be coming at the last moment. We will be in a hurry to complete the tax audit. But after listening to you, we has known the importance of the documentation too. What precautions to be taken to do the documentation. Thank you very much, sir, for enlightening our members on the document importance. I request our secretary, Vasudev Murthy garu, to propose vote of thanks for the session.
Chairperson of Visakhapatnam branch, CAG Bharti Devi, and today's resource persons, CAS Ramesh, and past chairman and dear professional colleagues, a very good evening to all of you. Really, it is a wonderful presentation on this documentation part, because normally this documentation of always documentation means we think of our Raman Rao garu and auditing standards. So really, it is a good presentation, Ramesh garu, wonderful presentation, and you have enriched the knowledge of our members by discussing all the documentation and SA 230, and because this documentation is so important in auditing standards, and also auditing standards also we discussed, and you have created a lot of importance, and you have to enlighten us in the point of view of the peer review also. Really, we, on behalf of the Visakhapatnam branch and on my behalf, we thank you, wholehearted thanks to you, Ramesh garu, from bottom of our heart. And I also thank our past chairman, MC members, and senior professional colleagues, and thank you for patiently heard this seminar and webinar, and raised the appropriate queries wherever needed. Thank you, Ramesh garu, thank you one and all, and thank you our chairwoman Bharti Devi for giving me this opportunity, and thank you one and all.
మేడం భారతీదేవి గారు